One of the most prolific television series creators working today is Michael Schur, and he has had the distinction of having 3 wildly acclaimed sitcoms on the air over the past number of years, taking place in 3 distinct locations with a wide variety of entertaining characters. Schur got his start writing on Saturday Night Live, and then later on, The Office, and it was from working on that mockumentary series he began developing a show about small-town government. Parks and Recreation borrows the documentary format and handheld cameras from The Office, but Schur and Greg Daniels managed to make it its own thing. While The Office was based around cringe comedy, Parks and Recreation has more of a gentle spirit, as Schur seems to genuinely love these characters. We do generally root for Leslie Knope to succeed in fulfilling her projects, and her enthusiasm, as wonderfully played by Amy Poehler, is infectious. That the other characters don't have quite the same unending enthusiasm for government work as she does allows her to stand out. Ron Swanson ends up being a major scene stealer in particular, as Nick Offerman plays this completely apathetic character utterly straight-faced. The additions of Ben Wyatt and Chris Traeger further manages to spice up the series, along with the eventual romantic pairing of deadpan April Ludgate and the slightly dim-witted Andy Dwyer. Although it's certainly surreal going back and seeing Chris Pratt in his pre-Guardians of the Galaxy and Jurassic World days. When you ask most people what episodes of Parks and Recreation they tend to gravitate towards, they usually focus on the ones with the characters hanging out together and getting into shenanigans. Yet, strangely enough, I tend to have a preference for those where we see Leslie doing her government work, whether it's trying to get a park built or working on the city council. Schur and the other writers really nailed the lengthy and annoyingly long process it takes to get things going in local government. The writers managed to spin this into humor, and it works as a brilliant satire on the process. One of the oft-mentioned things said about Parks and Recreation is how the first season was still finding its wheels, and the series did not hit its groove until the second season. I'm in the minority in that I actually really liked the first season, and that's what turned me on to the show. The characters, of course, became more developed as the series progressed, but it felt like jumping right into this community. I like how the first season goes nitty-gritty into the creation of this pit and trying to get it filled in. It might be funnier if you're familiar with zoning bylaws and local governments, and it is scary how accurate the first season is to the mundanity of local government. However, I can also understand why viewers tend to gravitate more towards the later seasons, and the series certainly became more endearing as it went along. Schur next collaborated with Dan Gore to create a show set in a police precinct, Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Like Parks and Recreation, a lot of the humor comes from the interactions between the characters as they attempt to best do their jobs. While Andy Samberg is the top-billed actor, Brooklyn Nine-Nine is definitely an ensemble show, with each episode giving the police officers something to do. What the show does wonderfully is establish their personalities while still nicely fleshing them out. The relationship between Samberg's Detective Jake Peralta and Captain Raymond Holt could have been the standard odd couple pairing of the immature and wacky detective and his stoic and no-nonsense boss, but the writers make them into 3-dimensional personas and don't rehash the same jokes in every episode. Ditto with tough cop Rosa Diaz, the bookworm and detail-obsessed Detective Amy Santiago, and the sensitive, buff, and yogurt-loving Sergeant Terry Jeffords. I find the scene stealer of Brooklyn Nine-Nine, though, is not even one of the police officers, but rather Gina, the captain's assistant, as played by Chelsea Peretti. Gina's devil-may-care attitude is played quite brilliantly by Peretti, who often says multiple things that catch her co-workers off guard. While the series has multiple episodes with stakeouts and chase scenes, part of the appeal of the series is how it often depicts the paperwork and other seemingly boring activities the police are required to do after they nab a criminal, and a lot of time is spent just sitting around and doing detective work. This adds a lot to Peralta's personality, as he's clearly somebody raised on police shows and action movies like Die Hard. One of the other delights of Brooklyn Nine-Nine comes from its cold openings. These serve as neat little bonus scenes that don't really contribute to the episode's story, but rather exist to further show the strong interactions between the characters. Being a modern sitcom set in a police precinct, there are moments when it touches on issues like police brutality and racial profiling, but it handles those topics in an appropriately sensitive manner. One episode where Terry gets racially profiled by policemen really shows Terry Crew's acting chops, although I don't think he was necessarily acting. Like Parks and Recreation, Brooklyn Nine-Nine works thanks to its likable set of characters and finding a lot of funny scenarios out of a not traditionally humorous setting. Next, Michael Schur created a sitcom with a more philosophical bent, The Good Place. Depicting a seemingly utopian version of the afterlife, Schur takes full advantage of this concept by structuring it around the ethical and moral dilemma of Kristen Bell's Eleanor, who is far from deserving of the good place. Universal Television seems to have given Schur a sizable enough budget to play around and creates all sorts of wild visuals. One of the highlights of the show comes from Janet, a Siri-like source of information, and Darcy Carden nails the perkiness and helpfulness of this human computer. Then there's Ted Danson as the architect of the good place, and Danson does a wonderful job of portraying somebody trying to hold it together as the place he built becomes unpredictable due to Eleanor's presence. Most of the humor comes from exploring the personalities of a select group of good place citizens and how the little flaws eventually revealed and crack through. The show also uses flashbacks to great effect to further expand on Eleanor, ethics professor Chidi, boastful philanthropist Tahini, and Buddhist monk John Yu. The frustrations that Eleanor and Chidi go through as they attempt to make her more morally upright and a good citizen are particularly funny. I don't want to talk more about The Good Place because that would spoil the fantastic Season 1 finale that takes the show from being just a funny depiction of the afterlife to something quite brilliant. Needless to say, with Parks and Recreation, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and now The Good Place, Michael Schur has proven himself to be a comedic voice in the modern sitcom landscape with 3 television series absolutely worth giving a watch. See you next time.